Alexander II, or in Russian Alexandr II Nikolaevich, or Alexander II, son of Nikolai, was the Russian emperor or Tsar from his father's death in March 1855 until his own assassination in March 1881. He was born in April 1818 and therefore was 62 when an assassin was able to wound him mortally by throwing a bomb at his feet in St. Petersburg. Despite his so-called great reforms, thousands of people in the Russian portion of Poland started a revolt in 1863 that was brutally suppressed in 1864. The earlier revolt in 1830 to 1831 had taken away Poland's fairly wide self-government, albeit controlled one. This revolt made Poland, or its eastern and central parts, subjects of a policy of systematic Russification. Legally, the Poles living there could only use the Polish language in their private conversations. All public and even private education was to be given in Russian, although there was private Polish education, secret Polish education, one of whose beneficiaries was Miss Marie Skłodowska, later known as Marie Curie, an internationally famous chemist, along with her French husband Pierre Curie. Alexander II received a traditional education of future Tsars, including knowledge of the major European languages. I assume these were counted as German, French, and English. And then, of course, courses or tutorials in government, administration, history, military, and so forth. His so-called great reforms included the abolition of serfdom in 1861, the institution of the principle of legal equality of Russians regardless of their social status under the courts, and a reform of the courts, the institution of a system of local and regional self-government known as Zemstvo, although it depended on an unequal right to vote, where the right to vote was based on the amount of land owned, and therefore the aristocrats were hugely overrepresented in those Zemstvo boards. Nevertheless, the Zemstvo elections were regular and, by that time's Russian standards, at least reasonably free and fair. Women, of course, could not vote, and neither could those men who could not meet the property requirement. And since the voters were grouped into social classes, this made the system of voting more unequal. He also expanded especially higher education and to some extent lower education. Literacy became gradually more common throughout the Russian Empire, especially its western parts. The Russian culture flourished. Although he was a Russian patriot, he often spoke and wrote in German when dealing with his family members, relatives, and friends, and occasionally he mocked the Slavophiles who idealized the Slavic nations and cultures. Local judges were elected by those men who could meet the property requirements. Officially, the corporal or bodily punishment was ended, and this was an important reform. The brutally lengthy 25-year Russian conscription was at last reduced to a more reasonable 6-year conscription. Also, the Russian army was modernized, and then the Russian transportation system gradually was modernized with the introduction of a fairly extensive network of railways. He also ended some privileges of the nobility Military service became basically or mostly universal for Russian men of a certain age. However, there were several assassination attempts against him between 1866 and the one that unfortunately succeeded in 1881, meaning that there were many people in Russia who believed that the reforms did not go far enough. Russia still did not have an official constitution, and it still did not have a national legislature, even as an appointed one. Tragically, on the eve of his assassination, or right before his assassination, he was about to approve a plan by his advisor, Mr. Loris Mielikov, that would have established two appointed legislative commissions, and arguably, if implemented, could have led to the introduction of an elected legislature, or at least to the introduction of a two-chamber national legislature with an elected lower house. This one only was implemented in 1905-1906. Alexander pivoted towards foreign policy and sold Alaska to the United States in 1867 because he feared that this remote control, separated by the Bering Strait from the rest of Russia, would fall into British hands if there was another war. He moved away from France when Napoleon III was deposed in 1870, and in 1872 he joined Germany and Austria in the League of the Three Emperors that stabilized temporarily the European situation. Despite his otherwise pacifist foreign policy, he fought a brief war with the Ottoman Empire over the oppression of Bulgarians in the Balkans of southeastern Europe. In 1877-78, he pursued further expansion into Siberia and the Caucasus and conquered Turkestan. He was disappointed by the Berlin Congress's results in 1878, but abided by that agreement. By his empress court consort Tsarina Maria Alexandrovna, he had 8 children, 7 of whom survived into adulthood. He especially placed hope in his eldest son, Tsarevich, or son of Tsar Nicholas, who, however, died. And therefore he was succeeded by his second oldest son, also known as Alexander. The Tsarina died in June 1880. Already 1.5 months later, in late July 1880, Alexander II married his longtime mistress, Catherine, breaking the Orthodox custom, which required a minimum period of 40 days of mourning between a spouse's death and the remarriage of a surviving spouse, eliciting criticism in foreign courts. So June the 3rd and July the 18th were the days. If Alexander II had left the area where the first explosion had taken place, it had slightly damaged his bullet-proof steel carriage. If he had not exited his carriage, which afforded him safety, and he had left the area immediately, he probably would have survived. However, he wanted to inquire about how the wounded were doing, and then Mr. Ignacy Hryniewiecki threw a bomb at the emperor's feet, shattering his legs and ripping his stomach open, mutilating his face. He whispered, "Take me to the palace to die there." An Orthodox priest, maybe the court chaplain, was rushed there to give him communion and the last rites. When the attending physician, Mr. Sergei Botkin, was asked how long it would be, he replied up to 15 minutes, and at 3:30 p.m. that day local time, Alexander II passed away and his personal flag was lowered for the last time. One of his last acts was the approval of Mr. Mikhail Loris Mielikov's constitutional reforms, which could have transformed Russia more peacefully into a constitutional monarchy.